November 1943. A captured airfield in occupied France, and after that, the long flight east to Rechlin, the testing station 70 miles north of Berlin that did not appear on any civilian map and that most Germans had never heard of. Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche had been sent to look at an aeroplane his own side had already decided was a joke. The ground crews had been laughing at it for days, a fat American machine with a barrel for a body. Sitting at the end of the runway in fresh German paint, one of them called it a flying milk bottle. The intelligence briefings agreed with the mechanics, which did not happen often. The Americans, the reports said, built motor cars and refrigerators. And this was what came out the other end when a country like that tried its hand at a fighter. Too heavy, too big. A crude engine bolted into a crude airframe to cover for the failings of both. Before we go on, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if you're loving this story, subscribe, because tomorrow we have something extra special waiting for you. Lerche had read those briefings. He had also taken quiet note of who wrote them, because that was the kind of officer he was. He was a trained engineer as much as a pilot, and by this point in the war he had flown more than 100 different aircraft types, German, Soviet, British, very often with no manual and no pilot's notes at all, learning each machine by taking it into the air and asking it questions there. His reports had a reputation that made his superiors uneasy. When an enemy design was good, he wrote that it was good. So, he walked around the fat American fighter the way he walked around everything slowly, looking for the lie in it. And the part of the aircraft that everyone had mocked, the part that made the whole thing look so wrong on the tarmac, was the engine and the swollen body that had been built to feed it. By the time he had finished with it, he was not laughing. He was not making a speech either. What that engine did to him was a good deal quieter than a speech, and a good deal worse for Germany. Lerche was born in 1914. His father died when he was 5. The family moved to Breslau, and they lived on a librarian's wages and a small pension that the post-war inflation kept eating away. He found his way into the sky through gliders, the only cheap way up for a boy with no money behind him, and in 1931, on a gliding course, he met a pleasant young woman who turned out to be Hannah Reich. He earned his certificates, taught gliding, and studied engineering at the same time. When his military service came round, he steered himself into the Luftwaffe, passed through pilot training, and ended up at the experimental establishment at Rechlin, where Germany tested its own aircraft and any foreign ones it could lay hands on. Over his career, he would fly 125 different types. Few men anywhere had a better feel for what made one aeroplane better than another. To understand why the captured fighter unsettled him, you have to understand what the Germans had decided about engines. And you have to understand that the decision had been the right one for years. The Messerschmitt that broke Poland and very nearly broke Britain was built around a clean, liquid-cooled engine. And by 1943, the standard fighter engine was the Daimler-Benz DB 605. It was a fine piece of work. It used a supercharger driven off the engine through a fluid coupling, governed automatically by a barometric control. So, the boost came up smoothly as the pilot climbed, and he could keep his attention on the enemy instead of his dials. At the heights, where the Luftwaffe expected its fights to happen, somewhere between 15 and 22,000 feet, it gave a German pilot strong power and a tight, willing aircraft. The cleverness carried a hidden cost that only showed itself when you climbed. A supercharger geared to the engine is turned by that engine, which means it is forever taking a bite out of the very power it exists to protect. Low down, in thick air, a Daimler-Benz blower could swallow more horsepower than it handed back. The arrangement was light, smooth, and reliable, and it did its job inside the band it was tuned for, but it had a ceiling built into it from the start. Push the same engine into genuinely thin air, and there was only so much a single geared supercharger could do. Above a certain height, the power began to drain away on its own, and no amount of skill in the cockpit could put it back. So that was the bargain German engineering had struck. A lighter engine, a simpler installation, power in the band where the war was meant to be fought, and a small, sharp fighter wrapped tight around it. For the War of 1940, the war of quick scrambles and short fights over friendly ground, it was close to perfect. The Americans had been asked a different question, and they had answered it with a different engine. The American question had been set by geography and ambition at the same time. If your bombers are going to fly from England into the middle of Germany in broad daylight, then your fighters have to go with them, climb to the same punishing heights, and still have something left to fight with when they get there. An engine that faded at altitude was no use for that at all. So the requirement came down from the top with one hard demand at the center of it. Full power, high up, and everything else, weight and size and grace, was made to bend around that. The aircraft on the Rechlin tarmac was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and the way it had reached Germany was its own small story. In November 1943, a Thunderbolt came down intact near Cannes, close enough to the front that everything had to be done at speed. Lerche's orders were to evaluate it himself. A fighter ace from a unit nearby had ideas of his own and wanted to fly the prize too. And rank being what it was, they settled on a compromise. Lerche would get the aircraft into the air and fly alongside to confirm it was sound. And then the ace would take it on from Caen to Cormes. Getting it airborne was the first test, and the Thunderbolt passed without fuss. It needed a longer run than a German fighter to come unstuck, which was no surprise in something that heavy, but it tracked straight, lifted off cleanly, and climbed without complaint. Lerche flew it the way he flew everything he could not read a manual for, asking one careful question at a time, low first, then higher, then steep, watching how the machine answered each one. The answers, set down later in the flat prose of a test report, did not flatter his own side. Captured Allied machines like this one passed into a strange traveling world. A special unit at Rechlin patched them up and put them back in the air, and a touring outfit that the men called the Wandering Circus of Rosarius painted them with bright yellow undersides and tails so that German gunners would not shoot them out of the sky, marked them with the code T9, and drove them from one frontline field to the next. Pilots who had been losing friends to these aircraft for months could finally walk around one on the ground, climb into the cockpit, put their hands on the controls, and ask the question they had been asking in the air for a year, without ever getting close enough to hear an answer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If this is the kind of history you come here for, the version the test pilots wrote down rather than the version that flattered anyone, a tap on the like button keeps it in front of the next person who goes looking for it. It costs nothing, and it matters more than the number suggests. Lerche started with the body, because the body was the thing everyone pointed at, and the body was the first clue. The Thunderbolt was the heaviest single-engined fighter of the war, over 17,000 pounds with everything aboard, and its fuselage was as deep and round as a medium bomber's. To German eyes that looked like waste, it was nothing of the kind. The shape had been forced on the aircraft by the way its engine breathed. Republic's chief designer was Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian émigré with a stubborn idea about high altitude. He understood that to keep an engine making full power in thin air you had to squeeze that air back to sea-level thickness before it ever reached the cylinders. And he chose to do it with a General Electric turbo-supercharger spun by the engine's own exhaust. The price was the plumbing. The turbocharger lived in the rear fuselage behind the pilot, which meant the exhaust had to be carried the whole length of the aircraft to reach it and spin it, and the compressed air had to be carried all the way forward again to the carburetor, with an intercooler in between to keep it from cooking on the way. All of that had to fit inside the fuselage. The barrel body the mechanics laughed at was the casing of a flying air compressor. The milk bottle was the shape of the engineering. It was worth the trouble for one reason above all. The exhaust that drove the turbine was energy the engine was throwing away in any case, blasting it out of the stacks as heat and noise. A geared supercharger has to be paid for in crankshaft power every minute it runs. A turbocharger runs on the waist, and high up, where every horsepower is worth twice what it is worth on the runway, that waist came close to free. Veli had bought the top of the sky and paid for it in fuselage volume instead of engine power. The fat body the mechanics mocked was the receipt. Then he looked at the engine itself. It was a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, America's first 18-cylinder radial. 2 rows of 9 cylinders, air-cooled, displacing 2,800 cubic inches and giving out around 2,000 horsepower. It had first flown in 1940, the same engine family that drove a prototype Corsair past 400 miles an hour, and it made the American Air Staff lose most of their interest in liquid-cooled engines on the spot. To pack that much power into an air-cooled head without melting it, Pratt & Whitney went at the problem with a kind of manufacturing arrogance. Rather than cast the cooling fins or forge them roughly, they cut all of them at once out of the solid metal of the head with a gang of milling saws that fed across the forging in a single guided pass, every fin thin, every gap even, on every cylinder, on every engine that came down the line. Later versions drank a mix of water and methanol on demand to hold even more power for short bursts in a fight, pushing past 2,300 horsepower when a pilot shoved everything forward. The Smithsonian's own description of the type is blunt about what all of this bought. When the engine appeared, it made more power at altitude than anything in the world. Altitude was the whole point, and altitude was where the captured fighter stopped being funny. Down low, the Thunderbolt was no threat, and Lerche said so without softening it. It was heavy and slow near the ground, around 500 kilometers an hour, and a Messerschmitt would walk away from it. But as he climbed, the gap closed and then it turned over. The American heavy bombers did their work between roughly 23 and 28,000 feet. That was where the flak was set to burst, where the interceptors had to drag themselves up to make their attacks, where the real war over Germany was settled. It was also the exact band in which the German engine was running out of breath while the turbo went on, shoving sea-level air into the R2800 as though the aircraft were still sitting on the runway. Above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt held power that the DB-605 could no longer match. Around 30,000 feet, it was the faster aircraft by a comfortable margin. Lerche took it up near 29,500 feet and saw better than 640 kilometers an hour. His verdict, when he set it down, was the verdict of an engineer and not a salesman. The P-47 was a poor dogfighter and a poor low-level machine, but it was, in his words, excellent in higher altitudes, in diving attacks and flying at maximum boost. Read in a hurry, that is faint praise. Read the way a German officer would have read it in 1943. It was something close to a sentence handed down. The Luftwaffe had built its fighters for the middle of the sky. The Americans had taken the top of it. In a dive, the difference grew teeth. A heavy aircraft falls hard, and the Thunderbolt fell harder and faster than the German fighters and stayed in the pilot's hands while it did it. So a P-47 in trouble could put its nose down and leave its hunters behind. German pilots had already been writing reports about damaged Thunderbolts that should have been simple kills accelerating away from them toward the ground. Lerche felt for himself why those reports kept arriving. This was the use of the whole strange traveling circus. Once Lerche and men like him had mapped where the Thunderbolt was strong and where it was weak, the lesson could be carried to the squadrons. Do not climb up to meet it on its own ground. Do not chase it down into a dive, because it will outrun you to the earth and reach it first. Drag it down low where it is heavy and dull. Force it into a tight, slow turn where a lighter Messerschmitt still kept the edge. And never try to win the fight at the height the American engine had been built to own. It was sound advice. It was also an admission, dressed up as tactics, that the high sky now belonged to somebody else. There was one more thing inside that engine, and it was the part that stays with you. An air-cooled engine has no radiator and no coolant in it. There is nothing to bleed out when metal passes through. A liquid-cooled engine like the DB605 lived or died by a few feet of vulnerable pipework, and one bullet through the cooling system would bring it down inside a few minutes, however good the man at the controls. The R2800 had none of that to lose. The record on this is not gentle. The Double Wasp earned a name for running on after an entire cylinder had been shot clean off the engine, and after an oil line had been torn open and most of its lubrication had drained into the slipstream. Still, you could hurt it badly, and it would still carry a man home. Lerche, sitting in the cockpit of a fighter his own briefings had called crude, was studying an engine that was harder to kill than anything his side flew. To feel what that meant, you have to leave the test field and go up with a man who needed it. On the 26th of June 1943, 48 Thunderbolts of the American 56th Fighter Group were escorting bombers home from a raid near Paris. A young lieutenant named Robert Johnson was flying at the back of the formation, the worst place to be, when 16 Focke-Wulf 190s fell on them out of the sun. Johnson's aircraft was hit almost at once and hit hard. Cannon shells walked through it. The canopy jammed shut on buckled metal. Oil sprayed back across the windscreen and over his face. Instruments shattered. Control cables parted. It was, and the engine shook hard enough that he expected it to tear itself off its mountings. By the count, afterward, there were 21 20mm cannon strikes in that airframe and more than 200 machine gun bullets. By every rule of the air war, he should have been dead or hanging under a parachute. He was neither. He turned the wreck toward England and fought to keep it level. What came next became one of the famous stories of the war. A German fighter slid up alongside the crippled Thunderbolt and fired into it, again and again, until its ammunition ran dry. The American would not go down. The German pilot pulled level, looked across at the holes in an aircraft that refused to die, rocked his wings, and turned for home. Johnson flew on across the channel and landed. They had to lift him out of the cockpit. He began counting the holes and gave up somewhere past 200. Within days, he was flying again, in a fresh aircraft that an armorer had named Lucky. The aircraft had a nickname by then. Its pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and the 56th Fighter Group flew it harder and better than anyone, turning out aces like Francis Gabreski alongside Johnson. And Johnson understood exactly why he was alive, and he said it in plain words after the war. The Messerschmitt, he pointed out, carried a liquid-cooled engine, and one hit in its cooling system put it into the ground. The Focke-Wulf and his own Thunderbolt carried air-cooled radials that took the same beating and kept turning. In his judgment, none of the German fighters were as rugged as a P-47. He finished the war as the second-ranking American ace in Europe, with 27 victories, and he spent a fair part of the rest of his life crediting the engine in the nose for the fact that he had a life to spend. This is the place to say the obvious thing. The men who flew these machines, on every side, carried details in their heads that never reached an archive. If your father or your grandfather flew or fixed or fueled aircraft in that war, any Air Force, I would be glad to read about it in the comments. What unit, what theater, what they flew or kept running. Those things belong in the record, and the record is mostly the people who still remember. Lerche's quiet assessment and Johnson's 200 holes are the same fact seen from two cockpits. One man wrote down what the engine could do. The other lived because it did it. So here is the honest accounting, the kind Lerche himself would have respected. The German engine was not a bad engine. The DB605 was smooth, clever, and beautifully suited to the fight the Luftwaffe had planned to have. The choice between a supercharger geared to the engine and a turbocharger spun by the exhaust was never a choice between competence and incompetence. It was a choice about which war you thought you were fighting. Germany built for a fast, short, sharp fight in the middle altitudes over ground it held, and it built a light, lethal fighter to win that fight. America built for a long climb into the top of the sky over hostile territory, and it accepted a heavy, ungainly aircraft because the engineering that owned high altitude would not fit inside anything smaller. Picture the German pilot the assessment was really about. He is at 30,000 feet in a fine aircraft, and his engine is laboring, giving him perhaps 3/4 of the power it makes down low, and he is trying to climb the last stretch to a bomber stream he can see, but cannot quite reach. Above him, where he cannot follow with any real authority, the escorts are waiting in aircraft whose engines do not seem to know they have left the runway. He has the better dogfighter, and it does him no good, because the fight is taking place in the one part of the sky his engine was never built to enter. That was the trap, and it was an engineering trap, sprung long before either man took off. That is the point that should have chilled anyone who read Lerche with care. The turbo-supercharger that handed the Thunderbolt the top of the sky needed a fuselage the size of a bomber's to carry its ducting, its intercooler, and its turbine. The German fighters had nowhere to put any of it. There was simply no room inside a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf for the long runs of pipe and exhaust-driven turbo demands. Even if every line of the assessment had been believed at the top, believing it would not have been enough. To answer the American engine, Germany would have had to design a new airframe around it and then build that airframe in numbers. In factories, the Allied bombers were already taking apart, and numbers were the last cruelty in the whole story. The engine Lerche admired was no clever one-off from a back workshop. By the end of the war, more than 125,000 R-2800s had been built, one of the largest production runs of any aero engine ever made, and more than 15,000 of them went into Thunderbolts alone. Everyone was, near enough, the twin of the last. The Germans could study a captured example on a yellow-bellied tour of their own airfields and understand every nut and fin of it and still come no closer to the thing that actually decided the war, which was the power to turn out tens of thousands of them and the fuel to keep them in the air. Which brings us back to the word in the title, and to the truth sitting underneath it. Lerche did not stagger out of that cockpit lost for words in the theatrical sense. He was not that kind of man, and the memoir he wrote decades later is calm from the first page to the last. The silence in him was a different thing. It was the quiet of an engineer who had just felt through the controls and through the steady, unbroken note of an engine that would not falter, the exact shape of a problem his country could not solve. He had spent an afternoon proving that the aircraft his own side called crude was harder to kill, stronger at altitude, and built in far greater numbers than anything Germany flew, and that the reasons for all three were locked together inside that fat, mocked, barrel-shaped body. There was nothing he could say that would shift any of it, so he did the one useful thing a man in his position could do. He told the truth, in writing plainly, and left the people above him to do as little with it as they pleased. That is the whole of it. A Luftwaffe inspector climbed into a captured American engine, expecting to confirm what everyone already knew, and climbed back out knowing the reverse, and the hardest part was how ordinary the lesson turned out to be. The Thunderbolt held no secret and no genius. It had an engine that made its power where the war was actually fought, and went on making it, after it had been shot half to pieces, turned out by the tens of thousands by a country that had simply decided to build it that way. If this is the kind of history you want, the version the men wrote down when they thought no one important was reading, rather than the version that made everybody comfortable, the like button helps it reach the next person, and a subscribe brings you the next case. And remember that wars are settled by engines and factories and fuel, but the men who flew behind those engines had names and faces and people waiting for them, and they deserve to be remembered as exactly what they were. That's our story. If you enjoyed it, hit like, subscribe, turn on the bell, and tomorrow more stories are waiting for you. Thanks for watching.